Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation on bees, birds, and butterflies, pollinator conservation, why it matters, and what you can do. My name is Laura Coates, and I'm an AmeriCorps member serving through Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Conservation Nebraska's mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting communities, and increasing civic engagement, which we accomplish through locally led education efforts and community engagement projects to address local conservation concerns. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I have a few housekeeping rules to go over. For those joining online, your cameras are off and you will be muted throughout the presentation. Please type any questions you have in the chat or the Q&A section, and we will answer those at some point during the presentation. We will have a very brief survey following the presentation that should only take less than a minute to complete. This survey helps support programming like this one, so we appreciate you taking the time to fill those out. Tonight, we welcome Ted Burk, a biology professor from Creighton University, who has extensive expertise about pollinators. Thank you, Ted, for being here tonight, and we look forward to hearing your presentation. Everyone, welcome Ted.
Oops, sorry. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Well, thank you for coming out and thank you for your interest in this topic. It's certainly something that I have a great passion for, and I'm sure you do as well, or you wouldn't be here. So let's talk a little bit about the birds and the bees and the flowers and the trees, pollinator conservation. Okay, now, how do I advance the slide? That's not working. Oh, okay. I guess I just was pressed. Okay, so, all right. So this is what the landscape would have looked like in the Jurassic period, in the middle of the age of dinosaurs. Lots of vegetation. But what's missing? Color. And it's this is some more modern landscapes. And why that difference between a lush green world and a world with much more colors? The answer is pollinators. It's pollinators that are responsible for the bright colors that we have in the world today. So what is pollen? Often people think of pollen as the sperm of a plant, but technically it's not. Technically, it's a whole plant. It's something called the male gametophyte part of the life cycle. And a better way to think about it is a kind of a space capsule within which the sperm travels from one plant to another. And pollen are very different in their shape and color and arrangements. And so you can usually look at a sample of pollen and know what kind of plants came from. And this is true back even in fossil times. Pollen is extremely hard, and so it's preserved quite well. And so we have a lot of our information that we know about ancient environments comes from pollen, fossil pollen. All species that have sexual reproduction have a life cycle where they spend part of the life cycle with just one set of genes, the haploids, and another part of the life cycle where they have two sets of genes, the diploids. And in mammals like ourselves, that haploid stage is really just the sperm and the eggs. And once the sperm and the eggs combine, then you spend that biblical 10 as the diploid thing. Same thing in plants. Again, any organism that has sexual reproduction has those two phases of the life cycle. In plants, those are called the gametophyte, the part of the life cycle that makes the sperm and eggs, and the sporophyte, the part that makes spores, which have a very transient existence in higher plants. So when you look at something like a moss or a liverwort, you're actually looking at the gametophyte, the haploid part. But when you look at a higher plant, the conifers or ferns or flowering plants, what you're seeing as the plant is the sporophyte, the thing that comes after the fertilization has occurred. So again, in lower plants, of course, they originally came from organisms that lived in the water. Some of the algae are the closest relatives of the plants. And the first plants to come up on land were mosses and liverworts, and then later on ferns. But because they come from aquatic ancestors, for the sperm to get to the egg, it has to swim. And so those plants can only live, even land plants, they can only live in wet places. So this is why when you get mosses or liverworts or ferns, they have to live in a damp place. They can't live where it's very cold and the ground is frozen. They can't live in an area where it's very dry. They have to have at least enough of a surface film of water that they can swim, maybe just only a few inches, but to get from the plant that made them to the plant where the egg is and the fertilization can occur. So that was a really big limitation on where land plants could live until they invented pollen. So in the seed plants, which are the conifers and the flowering plants, you have, of course, the cones. This is a conifer. And so some of the cones produce the pollen, and other of the cones produce the eggs. And the pollen then is blown by the wind to be released from the cones, the male cones of one plant, to blow through the wind and then land hopefully on the right location. And you can see the odds of this are incredibly small. It has to land on a plant of the same species, but not just that, it has to land in the right position on a cone, for the pollen tube to grow and the fertilization to occur. So the trade-off was this allowed them to live anywhere. You could blow through the wind in a cold or a dry place, but it's incredibly inefficient. You had to produce countless trillions probably of pollen grains, for the tiny, tiny, tiny proportion of them to actually end up where they're supposed to go. So that's kind of what's shown here. This is down in North Carolina. All that stuff you see are pollen, being blown from the trees. So very little pollen makes it to where it needs to be. Therefore, you've got to make lots of it in order to get some of it to where it needs to be. And therefore, you get pollen allergies. So once that pollen was being produced in this vast amount, it was a natural food source. Pollen's pretty rich in nutrition. And so it was a natural food source for some of the early insects, especially beetles. For the last 300 million years or something, there's always been more beetles than anything else. So hungry beetles would probably come and forage on that pollen. And of course, in doing so, some of that may be rubbed off on their bodies. And then if they move to another cone to feed on some more of the pollen, then some of that might have rubbed off and got that pollen more efficiently to where it was supposed to be, as opposed to just blowing through the wind. So once that started to happen, then plants could evolve to more efficiently elicit pollinators to come and visit them and transport that pollen much more efficiently with these go-betweens, as opposed to just using the wind. So we think the first pollinators were beetles, and beetles are still very frequent flower visitors today, as we'll see a little bit later on. So from those conifers, or from those gymnosperms, the flowering plants evolved. And they have two different names. They're either called angiosperms, which means seed in vessels. So that's referring to the fruits, or they're called anthophytes, which means plants with flowers. So flowers and fruit are the two distinguishing characteristics of the flowering plants. And so similar sort of life cycle, but here, again, in the male part of the flower, the anther, the pollen gets produced. And then in the female part of the flower, the carpel or pistil, the eggs get produced. And now the pollen, again, in some species now, they've gone back to wind pollination, grasses and so on. But in the great majority of the flowering plants, it's a pollinator that picks up the pollen from the flower of one plant and then carries it to the appropriate location on the flower of another plant of the same species, and fertilization is eventually achieved. These are relatively new plants in the history of life on Earth. They first arose about 100 million years ago. There have been land plants for 300 million years before that. but they are so successful that they completely dominate the vegetation of the earth now. There's over 300,000 species of flowering plants in the world, and they comprise now over 90% of all the plant species. So this has been a successful strategy, but you'll notice that both of these things ultimately rely on cooperation, symbiosis with animals. The animals have to transport the pollen so that the sexual reproduction can occur, and then the fruit are designed to be eaten so that the seeds within the fruit are then spread by animals. So that's the trade-off. It's kind of you gained efficiency, but you've got kind of this dangerous dependence. If something happens to your animal, symbiont, your pollinator or your fruit disperser, then you're in trouble. So just a closer look again. If you look at a flower, it has 4 parts. It has the petals and the sepals, which are mainly for covering it while it's developing as a bud, or for advertisement to attract pollinators. But the gonads of the plant, as it were, are the male parts, the anthers with the stigma, with the anther, the stamen with the anther where the pollen is made, and then the stalk, the filament that holds that up. And then the female part of the flower, which is the carpel or pistil. And there you have the stigma. You kind of think of this as kind of like a bottle. This is kind of the lip of the bottle, and then the neck of the bottle, and then the swollen base is the ovary where the eggs are made. So the pollen has to be picked up from an anther and then carried to another flower of the same species, and deposited on the stigma. And then the pollen grain actually grows down through the style there to deliver the sperm ultimately to fertilize the egg. And then post-fertilization, that ovary then is what turns into the fruit. So for a pollinator to do its job, it has to pick up pollen from one flower, from the anther, carry it to another flower of the same species, which means it has to go to the same kind of flower, can't go and visit a different species of flower. Then it has to deposit the flower in the stigma so that the pollen tube can grow down and the fertilization can eventually occur. And so there's this long history of plants and animals co-evolving. In many cases, it's cooperative. The plant provides some inducement, pollen, but mainly nectar, and maybe sometimes other beneficial things. Some bees will collect waxes and oils that they use in their courtship and so on. And so you get, kind of things like hummingbirds and bees and hummingbird moths, and their different sort of specializations in terms of different species of flowers and so forth. But, in any sort of partnership, there's also the potential for one partner to exploit the other. And it works both ways. There are plants that exploit the insects. For example, there are thousands of species of orchids that cheat the pollinator. They resemble the female of the pollinator species. So they look like a female wasp or female bee. In some cases, they even release the sex pheromone of the female wasp or female bee. The insect comes and tries to mate with the flower, gets covered with the pollen, and then having kind of an insect-sized brain, they don't realize their mistake and they go and do it again and transport the pollen. Sometimes there will be odors given off which are, say, typical of, like for a butterfly, the caterpillars need certain plants as their caterpillar host plant. And so they might attract a butterfly by giving off the same smells as the plant that the caterpillar needs. And then some of them, attract their pollinator, in the case of flies, like blowflies, by giving off the smell and sometimes even the appearance of rotting meat. What's the flower that just flowered at Lawrence Gardens? That great big thing that, that's what they do. They produce this horrible stink, and that's to attract flies. They go in there thinking there's a dead animal in there, get covered with the pollen, and go back and do it again and transport the pollen. So these are all cases where you might say the plant is cheating the pollinator. But it can work the other way too. So here's a clever bumblebee. Now to get to actually achieve pollination, it has to go up into this tubular flower, get dusted with the pollen as it goes in, and then when it flies to another one, it kind of dusts the pollen off on the stigma. This guy's taking a shortcut. It's like chewed at the base to get into the nectar without going through and picking up the pollen. So this is what's called a nectar thief. And a lot of honeybees are really good at that. So a lot of the times honeybees visit flowers, they're just cheating the flower and drinking the nectar without actually picking up the pollen. So who are the pollinators? Well, we said there are 300,000 species of flowering plants around the world, and 88% of them, almost 90% of them, have animal pollinators. The others are ones that have gone back. They've reverted back to wind pollination. So, plants that grow in very thick sort of, aggregations like grasses, with so many grasses or forests, they can afford maybe to not invest in the nectar and so forth to attract the pollinators. They can go back to wind pollination. So, a lot of our basic grains, wheat and rice and things like that, they've gone back to wind pollination. But the vast majority of the flowering plants still rely on an animal pollinator. 75% of the world's crops have animal pollinators. Now, only about a third of an average person's diet in terms of calories comes from animal pollinated plants, because of course so much of our calories come from grains that don't require pollination from an animal pollinator. But that still amounts to 9% of total world crop production and $187 billion roughly a year in terms of crops that require animal pollination. And of the 90% of the flowers that require an animal pollinator, 90% of them, the pollinator is an insect. So 80% roughly, so something like 250,000 plant species around the world rely on animal pollinators to be able to reproduce. So what are some of the pollinators? Again, well, we'll save the insects for last, since that's my thing. But birds and bats are important pollinators. Hummingbirds in the Americas, sunbirds and honey eaters in the rest of the world are pollinators. There's about 900 species. That's about 10% or so of all bird species actually act as pollinators. There's about 10,000 species of birds in the world. And they pollinate about 5% of the crop species, but includes things like bananas and papayas and nutmegs. There are about 500 species of bats out of something like 3,000 altogether in the world that pollinate. They pollinate 2% of the flowering plants. So between the birds and the bats, it's only 7%. But again, they pollinate 10% of crop species. Again, things like agave, bananas, balsa, etc. So there's just a couple of our individuals there. The most important pollinators, of course, are insects, and the most important pollinators of the insects are bees. And if you think about it, the other things that go to a flower and incidentally serve as pollinators, they're mainly after the nectar, right? But bees are after the pollen as well as the nectar. And so naturally, they're going to be more effective as pollinators because they're going for the pollen. And of course, they're going to collect that, mix it together with the nectar to form the bee bread that the bee grubs feed on. But they're also going to get a lot of it on themselves, on their legs, on their bodies, and so forth. And so they're going to achieve pollination. They're related, they're descended from certain kinds of wasps. And so somebody said the definition of a bee is just a hairy vegetarian wasp. And so this then shows you just a mason bee nest, a solitary, something like 90% of all the bees are solitary. They don't live in colonies like a honeybee or a bumblebee. And so they will build a nest, in this case, in kind of a hollow stem or something. They'll wall it off. Sometimes they'll line it with rosins, or leafcutter bees use pieces of leaves that they've cut and so forth. And then they'll put a bunch of that nectar and pollen mix, lay an egg on it, and the grub will then grow on that. They'll seal that off and then kind of put a bunch of these in a row until they've spent their summer doing that. So honeybees are, of course, the most well-known of the pollinators, but of course they're not native to the United States. The ones we have here honeybees are found in the Old World. There are a number of different species, and the one that we're familiar with, Apis mellifera, they're found in Africa, the Middle East, and in Southern Europe, and so forth. But of course, they've been spread all around the world by people. But they're an alien species. They're not native, and in some cases, they really can't do the pollination. Our native plants didn't evolve with honeybees, and so native bees sometimes are required for the pollination to occur. So honeybees are the ones that everybody thinks about when they think of bees. But in fact, there are 4,000 species of native bees in the United States. Nebraska probably has about 400. So all the bumblebees and sweat bees and mason bees and so forth, these are just some of them. bumblebees, carpenter bees, mason bees, leafcutter bees. If you look at your rose leaves or something like, you see nice little circles cut out. Those are the leafcutter bees. They use this to line their nests. They don't feed on it. Sweat bees, mining bees, many, many others. Anyway, so part of the challenge of really getting into this is being able to recognize the different kinds of native bees. And some of them, like the sweat bees, are lots of species and they're all kind of small and bright green and very hard to tell apart. Anyway, so bees are the most important pollinators. Oops, now I can't get it to work again. Huh. Why it works for her and it doesn't work for me. She's got the magic touch. Anyway, well, honeybees, when we think of honeybees, we think of honey, we think of beeswax, things like that. But that's small potatoes economically. Honey is worth $300 million a year in the US, but that's very small potatoes compared to the value of pollination. Bees, honeybees pollinate over 200 crops. And the value of those crops in the United States is about $19 billion a year. So that's what, 50 times the value of the honey. And worldwide, it's over $200 billion a year worth of crops that depend upon pollination by honeybees. But of course, that kind of neglects the contribution of the native bees. So even in terms of the crops, where honeybees are the main pollinators, honeybees are shipped all around the country to pollinate almonds in California and apples in Oregon and all over the place. But in the United States, pollination by native bees adds another $3 billion worth of crop production in a year. And even some things like soybeans, which are capable of self-fertilization and don't require pollination to produce beans, you get a greater yield from soybeans if bees have access to them, and the pollination can occur as well. Okay, so now this is kind of what your supermarket produce section would look like with bees, all the different fruits and things, and then this would look what it would look like without bees. So some things would still be there, but a lot of the things that we like would be missing from the produce section in the absence of bee pollinators. And native bees are important too. There's so many different ones, and they work with flowers in so many different ways. And so they can, achieve pollination kind of in a more specialized manner. This kind of bee may be a more efficient pollinator of this kind of flower than maybe a honeybee is. And so they supplement what honeybees do, but they also provide some pollination services that honeybees can't provide. Again, they are natives, whereas the honeybee is an alien. And so again, it's our native bees, the bumblebees and sweat bees and so forth, that these plants evolve that symbiotic, that mutualistic relationship with. So here's what's one example. There are a number of different plants, 6% of plant species, 64 different families of plants, where they require what's called buzz pollination. So the pollinator has to shake the anther to get the pollen to be released. And honeybees can't do that. And so things like tomatoes and a number of other crops that require that sonification or that buzz pollination, they require native bees to actually achieve that. So again, things like tomatoes, blueberries, cranberries, honeybees can't pollinate those, although sometimes they'll chew their way in and steal the nectar. But we need native bees too. So here's just an example of that sort of thing. This looks like a leafcutter bee or something that is kind of shaking the anther to get that pollen. So here's some of our native bees. This is from the Fauna Forest Nature Search website. So we've got things like longhorn bees, obviously bumblebees, cuckoo bees, mining bees, leafcutter bees. Don't know what that one is. Have to look. Oh, that's a sweat bee, duh. Anyway, so lots of different kinds that we have. Now, the second most important group of pollinators probably don't get the reputation that they deserve. These are flies. So it's probably the second most important group of pollinators and probably the least appreciated. So the main pollinators that people are familiar with are hoverflies or flower flies, the flies in the family Syrphidae. They have evolved to look like a wasp or a bee so that predators hopefully leave them alone thinking they are a wasp or a bee. But there's lots of other flies that visit flowers too. There are things called bee flies, tachinid flies, which are a group of flies that parasitize other insects, in terms of larvae. But then when they grow up as adults, they're pollinators. So there was a recent paper that surveyed all the different flies that pollinate around the world. And they said the hoverflies, the flower flies, are the most important group, but the other bees together actually made up more pollinators than the flower flies, the hoverflies did. So again, this is what the flower flies or hoverflies look like. Again, they have a resemblance to a bee or a wasp. So there's 3 of them. But then there are other kinds of flies that visit flowers and pollinate as well. Butterflies are the thing that I concentrate on, and we'll talk about in a minute some of our research and whether or not they really are important pollinators. Because again, just because you visit a flower doesn't mean you're a pollinator. You could be a nectar thief. So here are just some of our common butterflies. Our commonest butterfly is the orange sulfur. Its close relative, the clouded sulfur, is also common. Cabbage whites, they're an alien species from Europe. This is the green cabbage worms that eat your broccoli. And then the painted lady, which is the world's most widely distributed butterfly. They're found all the way around the world in the northern hemisphere, and wherever they are, they migrate. So we all know that the monarchs migrate to Mexico, but our painted ladies migrate to the Sonoran Desert in the winter. So they're down in Arizona now, and hopefully on their way back soon. Moths sometimes pollinate. We, just being diurnal animals ourselves, we tend to study things in the daytime. And so probably moths, which are active at night, probably way more important than we actually realize. People don't go out and study pollination at night by moths the same way that they go out and study pollination in the daytime by bees and butterflies and things. But one group of moths that are just really cool are the hummingbird moths, the sphinx moths. They're called hawk moths or sphinx moths or hummingbird moths. I like to think of them as hummingbird moths. And so here are 3 of those that you'll see visiting flowers. This is our commonest one. It's called the white line sphinx. You'll commonly see them around dusk. You see them in daytime too, but most commonly around dusk. And they like to go to deep-throated things like petunias. And then we have a couple of these that are bumblebee mimics. And so they're more active in the daytime. They're hoping a predator would think they were a bumblebee. They're actually bumblebee mimicking hummingbird moths. There's some other moths that will visit flowers frequently. Here's just a couple that are commonly seen on flowers in the daytime. A tiger moth and an owlet moth, the celery looper. Wasps are also important pollinators. Now, all wasps, other than those hairy vegetarian ones, wasps go out and collect other insects and chew them up and feed them to their grubs. So they're very, very important biological control in terms of the other insects that they, feed to their grubs. But of course, the adults then are mainly visiting flowers to get nectar. And so they're out hunting for prey to feed to their grubs back in the nest, but they themselves are spending a lot of time on flowers getting nectar. So here are just some wasp pollinators. This is a thing called the great golden digger wasp. They parasitize, they dig burrows in the ground, parasitize katydids, and then lay an egg on the poor helpless katydids are paralyzed but still alive. So they stay fresh down in the burrow, and then the grub kind of slowly consumes them until it's fully grown. So various kinds of wasps called a potter wasp. And, so they're actually, in some cases, the paper wasps that form the paper nests that you might have under the eaves of your house. They're very, very common pollinator in the fall on things like goldenrods and thistles and things. So again, wasps are, Heather Holm has written a number of books about pollinators. And so she got a really nice one about the wasps that serve as pollinators. The original pollinators were beetles, and you see a lot of beetles on flowers even now, things like soldier beetles, longhorn beetles, etc. But they're probably not very efficient pollinators. There's lots of them there, but there's 2 strikes against them. One of them is they tend to kind of settle down on a flower and like chow down on the nectar and the pollen, but they don't tend to move much from one flower to another, which you got to do to achieve pollination. The other thing is they tend to have kind of smooth, slick bodies that the pollen doesn't stick to very well. So even though there's lots of beetles on flowers, they probably aren't as important as pollinators as the other things we've been talking about. But you will see, as you'll see in a minute, you see lots of beetles on flowers. So again, the original pollinators, here's just some of the kinds of beetles that you might see on flowers. Again, there's many different kinds of beetles that visit flowers to feed, but they're probably relatively poor in terms of actually achieving pollination. So just a little bit, 5 minutes quickly about kind of the research that we've been doing. I was trained in studying animal behavior and especially insect behavior. So I studied fireflies and crickets and katydids and things like that. But I had a kind of an epiphany here about 25 years ago where I realized that things are disappearing so fast that there's kind of a triage situation. It's more important to engage in conservation and preserve our habitats and our species so that down the road we'll be able to do things like study their behavior. So I switched over to more of a conservation interest. I grew up down in the prairies of Kansas, and I've lived in Nebraska for 43 years now. And so, you know, with a long time, I started with insects in a 4-H entomology project as a teenager. And so since I was growing up in the prairie region and living in the prairie region and kind of interested in insects, what I decided to do was start a long-term study of butterfly populations in tallgrass prairies. So most of the work that we've done has been out at Glacier Creek Preserve. Hopefully you've all been there. If not, you really should check it out. 148th and State Road, kind of where Omaha and Bennington kind of bleed together. And it's a wonderful restored prairie, 50-year-old restoration, which is as much like a real tallgrass prairie as you could ever hope to find. And of course, it's managed by the University of Nebraska, and Dr. Tom Bragg has been the person in charge from the very beginning. And so this is what we decided to do. We started the Prairie Butterfly Project. So this has been going now for 26 years, and I've had more than 30 Creighton undergraduate students that have helped out on the project. So what we chose butterflies. I mean, they are attractive and kind of fun to study, but they can be indicator species. They have a close relationship with the plant community. So if you've got a lot of butterflies, you've probably got a healthy plant community. They can be a flagship species. All the other insects out there are important. There's probably several thousand species of insects at Glacier Creek Preserve, but the average person doesn't really care about the beetles and the flies and things like that, but they care about butterflies. So they can kind of be a representative of the insects in general. The public loves them. Umbrella species, when you do things to protect the butterflies, you're probably also doing things that will benefit the other insects. So if you have lots of nectar plants for the butterflies, those are also going to be things that the bees and the flies and the other pollinators can take advantage of. So they can kind of, preserving them helps with other things. The Xerces Society, how many of you are familiar with the Xerces Society? Good. It's the organization, the main organization for the conservation of invertebrate animals. And it's the #1 pollinator protection conservation group, certainly in the United States, probably the world. They have a wonderful set of resources, pamphlets and books and so on. We have local people here in Omaha and in Lincoln. So, if you're really interested in this, I really would urge you to join the Xerces Society. It's like $35 a year or something, because they're the people doing the most for preserving pollinators as well as other insects and other invertebrates. So they have this phrase, piggyback conservation. So these are projects or other efforts that promote conservation objectives of things which have wide public interest, things like monarch butterflies, but kind of more insidiously also promote other conservation goals. So our technique is simply for 25 years now, walk the same path of about 2 kilometers through the prairies once a week for 20 weeks every summer. And so we can, by walking the same exact path, I've walked that path 500 times now, at Glacier Creek, you can compare from month to month, from year to year, and kind of see, how the populations are doing. So it started out as just a study of the populations, how they're affected by the control burns and the other management techniques and so forth. And I must say that UNO is doing a fantastic job of managing Glacier Creek so that the populations are preserved well. But then we started about 20 years ago. When we do our walks and we count our butterflies, we'd also record every butterfly we saw in a flower. So we've now recorded over 20,000 flower visits by 50 species of butterflies visiting about 80 species of plants. So we have the second largest data set ever collected on one group of pollinators visiting flowers in one local area. There's a guy out in Colorado that got 40,000 butterflies on Colorado flowers. There's unless we go another 25 years, we're never going to catch James Scott. But anyway, so it's a very large database on, which butterflies go to which flowers, at least in these, more natural areas like the prairies. So here's just one example. So this is what we see visiting at the prairies, visiting, monarchs visiting. And so we've got, you can't really see it here because of this thing at the bottom, but we recorded about 1,800 visits of monarchs to flowers. And you can see that close to half of them are to this one species, the tall thistle. So I have become kind of an evangelist for thistles. Thistles, people know that there are invasive thistles that you are required by law to remove. But there are also a bunch of native thistles that are not a problem, and you should leave them alone. It's very easy to tell the difference. The native thistles, if you turn the leaf over, it's kind of white and fuzzy. If you take an alien thistle and turn it over, it's kind of slick and green and very prickly. So it works 100% of the time in our part of the world. It's very easy to tell a native, which is not invasive and not a problem, like the tall thistle, from the alien things like bull thistles and musk thistles and Canada thistles and so forth. These are not just for butterflies, but for bees and other pollinators as well. Thistles are the very best pollinator plants we have. In our part of the world, this is kind of a subjective impression, but my impression is in our part of the world, that's the flower that gets monarchs to Mexico. Down in Texas, they go to sunflowers, but in the Midwest here, to get to Texas and then get to Mexico, that's the flower that they need. A lot of other things, milkweeds here, there are 3 different kinds of milkweeds here, and a lot of other things. So this is just some idea, and we've got this for all the other butterflies as well. Anyway, so we've got lots of information on, who goes to what. And of course, this could be important, again, not just for, places like Glacier Creek, but also for people that want to have, a pollinator garden in their yard or in their school or something like that. Okay, now, one of the things we've gotten into lately is this question of, are butterflies actually pollinators? It'd be like cool if they were, but just because it'd be cool if they were doesn't mean that they are. They could just be nectar thieves. And there's surprising little studies few studies have been done. And they're kind of mixed. In some cases, they do seem to be pollinators. In other cases, they just seem to be nectar robbers. So it seems to vary, and we don't know much information. But for butterflies to be important pollinators, all 4 of these have to be true. They have to visit a flower and pick up pollen. They then have to be flower faithful, or flower cones, they have to go to another flower of the same species. And I've seen a butterfly, I saw one butterfly go to one species, and then the next visit was to a second, and the next visit was to a third, and the next visit was to a fourth. And so it wasn't doing any good. It was scattering pollen everywhere, but in the wrong place. Okay. So they have to be flower faithful. They then have to actually deliver the pollen to the stigma so the pollination can take place. And then they have to do enough of this to matter. If bees do 99% of the pollination, then it's kind of nice that butterflies occasionally pollinate something. They're not really that important in the big picture as pollinators. Again, lots of other reasons to love butterflies. And so there's surprising little information on all this. So here's just some preliminary results from the Creighton undergrads. So Hannah Mullally, she works for Pheasants Forever now as a pollinator specialist working with farmers to help them take advantage of Farm Bill programs. She sampled 27 orange sulfurs, and every single one of them she got them when they were on a flower, and she sampled them, and every single one of them was carrying pollen that it picked up. So they do pick up the pollen. Another couple of students looked to see if the butterflies were flower faithful. And so here's the regal fritillary, which is the main one of conservation interest in the tallgrass prairies of the United States. Here's that common one, the orange sulfur. And they would say, okay, you're on this flower now, what's the next one you went to? And they found that they were 90% or more faithful. So again, they're taking the pollen from one to another of the same kind of plant, which is what they need to do. And then the last thing, it's hard to see if they're depositing the pollen. It's easy to do a study where you keep the big things out and let the little things through and see if pollination occurred. It's a little harder to do a study where you keep the little things out and let the big things at it. So that pretty much has to be done as kind of a greenhouse experiment. We haven't been able to pull that off yet. Do they actually deposit the pollen in a place where it matters? Probably so, but it's trickier to get at that. But that last question, are they important? Well, we had actually a high school student. Creighton had a program to fund high school students for full-time summer research. And so Sydney Westfall, who works, I think, at Lawrence and Gardens now. She went to Creighton and graduated. I think she works at Lawrence and Gardens now. Anyway, she counted over something like 4,000. Yes, 4,000. She would go to a flower and just see what's on the flower, and got information for 4,000 flower visitors. And what's more there than anything else are beetles, like beetles all over the flowers. But again, they're probably not that important pollinators. But again, it was very interesting to find out that the second largest group of flower visitors were butterflies, even more than native bees. And this was out at Glacier Creek. So I think she only saw 3 honeybees all summer. So out in the prairies, it turns out to be probably the butterflies and the native bees that are probably doing most of the work. So that's good to know. They are an important enough part of the pollinator community that, they potentially could be important. But pollinations, as you know, are declining. They've been doing studies of butterfly populations in Ohio for decades now, and they're losing about 2% per year. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but you take 2% per year and carry it out over 30, 40 years, you got a lot less butterflies. The first bumblebee was just added recently to the endangered species list, the rusty patched bumblebee. They've been found in Nebraska. So that's an endangered species of bumblebee, and many other places. There was a place in Illinois where they had data from 100 years ago, and they went back and looked at the same place, and they found that half of the native bee species that were there 100 years ago aren't there now. So pollinations are declining. Why is that? Monarchs. Everybody knows about monarchs. The ones in our part of the world, most of Eastern North America, go to Mexico. This is the number, this is the decline in the numbers over the last 30 years. There are so many of them. There are 50 million per hectare, 20 million per acre. There are so many that they just measure how much of the forest do the monarchs cover. And it's an amazingly small area. There were 900 million of them, but they covered an area which would be smaller than UNO's campus. And when they hit bottom in 2013, 2014, that would have been only something like an acre and a half. They would have fit in Memorial. In Nebraska, I tell people they would have, all of the butterflies from the Gulf to Canada, from the Rockies to the Atlantic, they would have fit into Memorial Stadium. It recovered, but see, last year was really bad. Last year, it was only a couple of acres, and they think this year is going to be even worse. Last year was the second worst ever, and they think this year is going to be even lower. So, they're not making it to Mexico. Well, there's a number of reasons. Part of it is we're probably not making as many because of Roundup, Roundup-ready crops. A lot of the milkweed, the caterpillars can only grow up milkweed. A lot of the milkweed was growing in cornfields. And it was like super good milkweed because it got fertilized and irrigated and so forth. So you rear 4 times as many monarchs per plant in a cornfield as you did out in a prairie. So we've lost the total area of corn and soybeans that no longer has milkweed in it because the Roundup, the crops have been genetically engineered to be resistant to that herbicide. So when you apply that herbicide, it kills every plant except the corn and the beans. And so we've lost an area of habitat bigger than the state of Texas in terms of milkweed that was available for monarchs. There's also, in some places, like where I studied them at Glacier Creek Preserve, the numbers aren't down in the summer. We're making just as many in Glacier Creek as we ever did. Of course, it's not a cornfield, it's a prairie, so it hasn't had these changes in agriculture. But a concern is where even the ones that we're making aren't getting there. And that's thought to be because of things like droughts and an absence of fall flowers. They have to feed on the flowers to make it to Mexico, not just to fuel the migration, but to build up their fat to make it through 4 months without feeding down in Mexico. And so the last couple of years have been severe droughts in Texas, no sunflowers, nothing to feed on. And so a lot of them probably just aren't making it to Mexico anymore, or they're not surviving over winter. So there's multiple, they also have some diseases and so forth. So there are various problems, but probably the biggest problem is just a whole lot less milkweed than there used to be. And this is California. There, we've got, 1 million instead of, 1 billion. But even so, this was 30 years ago. And there were only, 4 years ago, there were only 3,000 as opposed to over 1 million. And this year, there were only 9,000. So there's a very real risk that the ones that go to California, the ones from west of the Rockies that go to California, there's a very real possibility that that migration will be gone. that we won't have them going, to places like Monterey where they have a monarch festival every winter and things like that. Okay, what are the threats? Habitat loss is the big one. Conversion of natural habitats for agriculture and then the use of genetically modified crops, urban development, roads cover a lot of ground. So just lots of habitat loss, alien species competitors. Honeybees compete with native bees. Here's another European bee, the European wool carder bee that's been introduced and competes. Diseases and parasites. So they have lots of diseases and parasites, and things that are parasites and diseases of honeybees can get transferred over to affect things like bumblebees. So they have a lot of problems with parasites and pathogens. And then, of course, direct poisoning by pesticides. So indirectly, Roundup glyphosate eliminates a lot of the food base, and then neonicotinoid insecticides kind of are devastating, as insecticides to pollinator populations. Monsanto made the herbicide, Bayer made the insecticides, and Bayer bought Monsanto. So Bayer now, all the corn that farmers have, 95% of it is Roundup Ready corn. It's all coated with neonicotinoid insecticides, the seeds are. And so, they're getting kind of a double whammy from the herbicides killing the milkweed, but already the corn and beans have all been coated with the insecticide, which is taken up by the plant and will kill anything kind of feeding on the plant. Climate change, of course, looms over everything. Projections show that where the monarchs go in Mexico now, 50 years from now, will not be suitable. They won't be able to survive there. Whether they can move anywhere else, we just don't know. It may be hardwired and they may not be able to adjust. Maybe they can. Anyway, so what can you do to help, you ask? Well, a lot of things. And we've got some people here that have some farmland and they have it in pollinator CRP production. That's wonderful because that's on a scale bigger than a person's backyard. But most of us just have our backyard or our local park or our local schoolyard or something where we could do something. So just some of the things you can do. Support local organizations, like Conservation Nebraska. I've been involved a lot with an organization called Nebraska Monarchs. Support national and international organizations. So for monarchs, the main organization is down at KU, University of Kansas, called Monarch Watch. So visit their website. They are the people that coordinate the monarch tagging that you may have heard of, the people do in the fall. The Xerces Society I've already plugged, by far the most effective pollinator conservation organization. Be an active advocate with local governmental agencies. So things like not mowing roadsides as often, planting native flowers along roadsides, loosening up on weed ordinances. Well, I've been written up twice by the city of Omaha for having weeds growing in my yard. And I pointed out that one of the weeds was the state flower of Nebraska. Another of the weeds were, the milkweeds and monarchs. The guy knew nothing about plants, but he had the Weeds of Nebraska book by the University of Nebraska, which is for farmers so they know what the weeds are in their crops. So everything except corn, beans, and wheat is a weed, right? And he said, if it's in the Weeds of Nebraska book, you can't have it in your yard. Well, there's a lot of people working to change those kinds of local weed ordinances and things like that. So be an advocate for that kind of change. Work with schools and youth groups. Educate and encourage your community members. If you have a lot of flowers in your yard and you have pollinators visiting, people will come and look and you can talk to them about it, and kind of what's going on and why. And it's not just a bunch of weeds. It's actually sort of get involved in citizen science projects. I'll show you a couple in a minute. And of course, the main thing for the average person is create a pollinator-friendly garden. Here's a couple examples of citizen science. Something called the North American Butterfly Association, sometime within a week or two of July 4th every year, does a local butterfly count to see what the populations of butterflies are doing. Some of you may know about the Audubon Society that does these Christmas bird counts. They've done them for over a century. So the butterfly people decided that we want something like that. Well, you want to go do a butterfly count in Christmas. So they do a July 4th count. And so we do these here in Omaha. I'm involved in one in Omaha. I'm involved in one in Lincoln. And so, there's hundreds of these that go on around the country every year. So we've got this tremendous database building up about how butterfly populations are doing all around the country. Another one, which is local, is Nebraska Bumblebee Atlas. So you can sign up to monitor bumblebees and see what bumblebees are visiting flowers in your area. It's kind of coordinated by the University of Nebraska and by the Xerces site and so forth. So you can go to the Nebraska Game and Parks website and find out about that, maybe sign up. And there's lots and lots of others where you can be, involved in actually getting the data, to support, what we know about pollinators and how they're doing. But again, you can create a pollinator-friendly garden. So number of steps you can take. One of them I say is mow less. Okay, well, it means things. Mow less area. Convert some of that grass to something else. The average yard is just a biological desert. So convert some of that to pollinator plants and so forth. Also, mow less often. There was actually a study that showed, mowing every 2 weeks is probably about the optimum for, insect populations. Too much, you scalp it off, to let some of the taller weeds begin to dominate, some of the taller plants dominate. About every 2 weeks kind of is a nice kind of disturbance, right, to keep the insect populations at most diverse. And don't mow so close to the ground. Don't scalp it off like a putting green. So mow less in 3 different ways. Create habitat essentials. So butterflies and bees and things, they need nectar plants. It's very important that you have things flowering all summer, from early in the spring to late in the fall, so that there's always something there. They like large blocks of color, and they like butterflies like sunny spots. They really like heat. They're heat lovers. So I got too many trees in my yard. We spent the first 30 years putting trees in. We're spending the next 30 years taking the trees out. But anyway, can't get it to work again. Or maybe it's this thing. That. Okay, that was it. Trees and shrubs are important, especially in the spring when not much else is flowering. Spring flowering trees can be really important as nectar sources for butterflies and bees. Lots of pollinators like lots of perennials. So milkweeds, which are a really favorite nectar plant for all kinds of pollinators, not just the leaves for the caterpillars to eat, the monarch caterpillars, but they're a really attractive pollinator plant or nectar plant for all kinds of pollinators. So here's just some Joe Pye weed, coneflowers, blazing stars, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is some New England aster that I have growing in my front yard. And it's too small to see, but there were actually 7 different migrating monarchs that were feeding on the New England aster, when I took that picture. So here's some of the things that the native perennials that the butterflies love: tall thistle, false sunflower, rigid goldenrod, ironweed, wild bergamot. You can get these. It's kind of harder to get these seeds, in plants than it is, your typical cultivated varieties. But there are places like Midwest Natives in Lincoln, or forgetting the place up in Minnesota. Anyway, there are places where you can get seeds and plants of kind of native plants. Some annuals are good: petunias, zinnias, verbenas, marigolds. Lots of different pollinators love some of those annuals. Try to go native. So for example, a lot of people have bee balm in their yard, which is beautiful and does attract hummingbirds and things. But we've got a native Monarda, wild bergamot, which is one of our absolute top pollinator plants. Like, why go to the store and get this cultivated variety? We can have this really cool native, which is very, very, very attractive to pollinators, wild bergamot. Oh, and I really recommend this book by Doug Tallamy, Bringing Nature Home. Again, talks so much about the importance of native plants as opposed to those cultivated horticultural varieties. You need other habitat. Butterflies, they need the host plants for the caterpillars. Bees need nest sites. 70% of our bees nest in the ground. Bumblebees, sweat bees, things like that. Some of them nest in hollow stems and things like that. But again, a little bare ground is valuable for ground nesting bees and things like that. The things like bumblebee queens have to overwinter in a brush pile or a hollow tree. So again, a nice brush pile or, something like that is a place for lots of things to overwinter. Source of water, sunny spots for basking. A lot of things go to fruit. And so a bee hotel really works for some kinds of bees, but don't buy those things that they sell you that they call butterfly houses. Nobody's ever seen a butterfly go into one of those things. They're great for growing spiders and wasps, which are not bad things to grow, but they're no good for butterflies. Well, again, it works, most of our bees nest in the ground, so it's not gonna be good for them. But some of the bees, like the mason bees and some of the others, they tend to, people have mixed results, but some people have had good luck with them. Doesn't sound like you have. No, anyway, but it can't do any harm. can't hurt. Again, milkweeds, got good nectar plants, but they're, of course, the only caterpillar plant for monarchs. Some trees are important caterpillar plants. In our part of the world, the best tree to grow caterpillars for butterflies are hackberries. We have 6 different species of butterflies whose caterpillars grow up on hackberry trees. Oaks are best in general for insects, but for butterflies in our part of the world, it's hackberries. Cherries are probably second best, etc. So you don't really think of trees as caterpillar plants, but they can be really important. So can grasses. We have one group of butterflies, which are quite common, little things called skippers, and a lot of them, the caterpillars eat grasses. Some grasses are important caterpillar plants. Some of the things that are host plants are things that people consider to be weeds. So the red admiral butterfly, which migrates to the south in the winter and then comes back every year, their caterpillar plant are stinging nettles. So have a little patch of stinging nettles in the corner where nobody goes, and that'll be good for the red admirals. Sulfurs, their caterpillars will eat anything in the clover family. Plantain is the caterpillar plant for the buckeye, and thistles are caterpillar plant for the painted lady, that one I said that is found all around the world. Brush piles are great for wildlife in general, including things like overwintering bumblebee queens. Go easy on chemicals. It's been shown that people in their yards use pesticides at much higher rates than farmers do on their crops. So relatively, it's like much worse in people's backyards. Chemicals used to control pests can also then, cause collateral damage. So you put down insecticides to kill white grubs. You also kill all the ground nesting bees and all the fireflies that are down in the ground. So go easy. And make sure when you go and buy a plant from a big box store, it hasn't been pre-treated with insecticides, because they want you to get a nice, perfect plant that you can plant and look at. Of course, they pre-treat it with neonicotinoids, and so anything that goes and visits that flower is killed. So go easy on the chemicals. Use them only when you really need them, and make sure you're not putting out poison, for the things you're trying to attract. But mainly cultivate, cultivate tolerance. Put up with some weeds, dandelions, white clover, plantain, violets. Those are all things that are good either for caterpillars or as nectar plants. The white clover is the favorite nectar plant of the little blue butterflies that are so common, things called the eastern-tailed blue. Don't be a clean freak. Leave the perennial stems. Lots of bees will, nest in the stems of perennial plants. So wait until next spring for the last year's grubs to emerge, and then clean up the dead stems, things like that. Leave some dead wood around. Don't have to clean everything up. My dad, he's like many people. He grew up, a person was a good person if they had a farm where everything was nice and clean and weed-free, and the barn was nicely painted red and so forth. We've got hundreds of years of Western cultural practices to overcome, to kind of preserve pollinators. Again, put up with things like spiders and wasps. They're the best biocontrol you have. Work way better than insecticides in most cases. You'll have to comply with city ordinances, but you can try to get them changed. You'll probably have to educate some of your, half the people that walk by my yard say, wow, this is wonderful. The other half, look at it, they shake their heads because of all the trash and the weeds. But it'll be worth it. And you won't just be helping pollinators, you'll be helping other things too. All those caterpillars are food for the birds. All those spiders and wasps are controlling the things that are eating your crops. There are a whole host of natural enemies of other insects that if you have a more natural backyard will be there and controlling the things that you consider to be pests. Here's some sources. There's Doug Tallamy's book I talked about. And then here are 2 of the books that are put out by Xerces. So these are all really good sources for things you can do in your own kind of backyard or schoolyard or park. Okay, so I'm finished. I guess I took pretty much the hour, but I don't know if you have time for a few questions or not. I'd be happy. Again, I'm sorry. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I need to be up here so that the answers get recorded. Sorry. Any other questions?
Pollinator garden. I want to do some more beds in my yard.
Sure. Right.
Is there some websites that have a good?
There are actually lots of different places that have good information. But again, the place that I would say is the go-to place is the Xerces Society. They have different sheets of preferred plants for all different areas in the country. They have just a tremendous amount. So I would go to the Xerces people first, and you'll probably find kind of, now again, there's a nice NEB guide. You know, UNL Extension has a nice NEB guide. So there's lots of information out there. But, you know, I always think that the go-to first place is Xerces. It's named for the Xerces blue butterfly, which was in the San Francisco area. It's the first butterfly in the US to go extinct.
Kathy asked, do houseflies pollinate?
Houseflies probably not so much. Yeah, they will pick up you know, fluids from, they probably will sometimes visit plants to get nectar, but they're kind of feeding more on just whatever kind of water and fluids are around, or, you know, dead carcasses or things like that. So probably not so much houseflies.
And then Kathy says, many trees and shrubs are host plants for pollinators
Yep.
too. Prairie Legacy Inc. sells plants in seed in Nebraska. Great talk, Ted.
Yeah, so this person has said Prairie Legacy is another source for plants.
Dorian says, has there been any interest or talk about trying to establish a monarch?
The Monarch Watch people down at KU, what they've proposed is, if you think about it, I-35, you know, starts up at the Canadian border and goes all the way down to the Mexican border. So what they have proposed is that we make I-35 like a monarch butterfly corridor with lots of you know, milkweed and nectar plants kind of on both sides of the highway. So that's one such proposal for a, you know, a monarch corridor, which basically would be, you know, I-35 going all the way down.
Mark asked, should I worry about the thousands of aphids?
Oh yeah,
milkweed
if you have milkweeds, they get covered with these little orange aphids called oleander aphids. Normally, they're not going to do any harm to the plant. It's pretty unsightly, and they're bright orange, so the things won't eat them because they take up the milkweed poisons too. But you know, they can be there in enormous numbers and not really do any harm either to the milkweed or to the monarchs.
Do monarchs have a favorite kind of milkweed plant?
That's a good question. We have lots of different milkweeds. 90% of our monarchs grow up on common milkweed, which is the one that just comes in, you know, gets in your yard, whatever. It's the one you find out in fields and stuff. So that's just, there's so much of it that's what most of them grow up on. But if they have a choice, the milkweed that they like the best for growing caterpillars on is swamp milkweed. So swamp milkweed is their preferred, although it's only a little bit better, you know, preference than common milkweed. Butterfly weed, which you can really get easily at the garden stores, butterfly weed or butterfly milkweed, it's not a very good caterpillar plant. It's a great nectar plant, but it's not the one to go for if you're only going to have one and you want to raise caterpillars. No, it's not as good as common or swamp milkweed would be. Good question.
Dorian asked, how would we know if a plant from the big box stores has been treated?
Yeah,
with
well, this was asked by the audience too. A lot of stores like Lowe's and Home Depot and people, they now will have a label that will say pesticide free. Now, whether or not you can always trust that is another matter. But then you can also get it from more reliable sources like Midwest Natives or someplace like that. That Nebraska Monarchs organization that I talked about, they have a great big plant giveaway every May. So kind of check out, you know, Nebraska Monarchs and look at their website, and, you know, you can get, you know, a couple dozen free, you know, good plants from them. You know, so kind of watch out for that. Last year, we got all our plants from Midwest Natives in Lincoln, and we gave out over 10,000 plants last May.
How does a person know when the plant purchased from the store has?
Well, again, that's hard to know. Again, the only thing you can do is either apply it from a place that you think is a reliable place or look for the pesticide-free label. Oh yeah, talk to Glenn Pollock. Yeah, Glenn Pollock and I know Glenn very well, and Glenn's a good source. We have lots of good people around here. Scream at the plants monarch butterflies visit. Okay, yeah. Well, again, if the talk is available, so he wanted to see that screen with the plants that the monarchs visit at the flowers the monarchs visit out at the prairie. But that would be if the talk is available online, you could kind of find that there. Arboretum, yeah, good. So yeah, the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum and Nebraska Extension, they have information on their websites too. Again, and the extension, again, there's some good web guides, nib guides. Let's see what else we got here. Okay, I think we got them all. Good. Yeah.
Is this your first time participating in a community conservation of this kind? Does that mean like hosted by this organization, or can it be like anything like Audubon County?
Yeah, it can be similar.
Just anything?
Yeah. There's a lot of good Audubon and Sierra Club. The Hitchcock Nature Center has an insect club that meets once a month all summer, from like May through September. So, you can, check out Hitchcock Nature Center over in Crescent, Iowa, and kind of come to the insect club meetings if you like. Yeah. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you everyone for coming.